Ahead of next week's UN Human Rights Council session in Geneva, which is expected to flag up a report on the situation in Gaza, activists here in Britain shut down a factory associated with the Israeli onslaught on the besieged territory. It comes as Israel's top military legal advisor says he's not concerned about the possibility of an ICC probe into the summer war that killed thousands of men, women and children. Norman Finkelstein's latest book is called Method and Madness, the hidden story of Israel's assaults on Gaza, and he joins me now. Welcome back, Norman. In this book, you mentioned that Tzipi Livni, the Israeli politician, put off a visit to London for fear of arrest. How seriously do Israeli politicians take a legal threat when they come to Britain?
It's hard to gauge right now how real the fears of Israel are, because they got past the Goldstone report. The new report was supposed by the Human Rights Council, the one that was headed by Shabbos. That's already...
He's just left.
Yeah, that's already been shot down because it's accused, Shabbos was accused of being a partisan to the PLO. He was forced to drop off. The person who replaced him, a New York State judge, she's rather weak.
Take us through the Goldstone report.
The report itself was actually quite devastating. It was a massive report, and it concluded Israel was trying to humiliate, punish, and terrorize the civilian population, that it was probably guilty of significant war crimes and crimes against humanity. It was a devastating report, and it caused Israel real fears. They didn't quite know what to do with it. When the report came out, it was sheer bedlam and hysteria in Israel. People like Shimon Peres, who was so admired in the West for reasons which are completely perplexing. Shimon Peres denounced Goldstone as a small man who knows nothing about international law, and that was actually the most polite of the denunciations of Goldstone. Alan Dershowitz of Harvard said that Goldstone was worse than Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz. Michael Oren said that the Goldstone report was worse than Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I mean, it went completely berserk.
Miliband or David Cameron here, politicians here from the mainstream parties will say they'll always try and equalize it by talking about rocket attacks from the Palestinians, which I know you do in this book. You do say that Paul Wolfowitz, the neocon former defense secretary, U.S. former defense secretary, said that it would all be fine if the Palestinians adopted gun-theist principles, which they're not because of these rocket attacks. Just take us through some of the analysis in the book about that.
Well, first of all, Palestinians have attempted nonviolent resistance, and we ought not to forget about that. You're too young, but I unfortunately am not, to remember quite vividly the first Palestinian Intifada beginning in December 1987. It lasted, de facto, it lasted about 2 years. I lived in the occupied territories during that time, off and on. It was a truly heroic a display of mass nonviolent resistance, and it had a real resonance internationally. It was called the maxim the Palestinians used were the stones, occasionally burning tires, and so it was attempted, but it was Israel applied pretty brutal repression at the time, and it was defeated. These things are completely forgotten now. All the human rights organizations, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they all report that Israel was engaging in methodical, systematic torture of Palestinian detainees. The estimates of Human Rights Watch were during those years, 1988 to 1990, the estimates by Human Rights Watch was they said, I'm quoting them, tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees were tortured. Now, that's a very interesting figure, if you allow me. It's not a digression, but it's from a slightly different angle. If you look at the current U.S. Senate report on torture, which created a huge international reaction, people don't seem to be aware. According to the report, we're only talking about, only in quotes, it was only between 39 and 44 cases of torture.
Each one of them obviously terrible and appalling as they are.
Terrible, but the interesting thing is, more or less, the kinds of torture that the CIA practiced against the 39 to 44 detainees, the kinds of torture were not much different than the Israeli torture. In the case of the Israeli torture, there wasn't rectal hydration, to my knowledge. There wasn't waterboarding, to my knowledge. And they didn't strip detainees to humiliate them. Okay, we'll leave those three aside. Aside from that, the repertoire of tortures were pretty much the same. The difference is the magnitude. In the case of the Palestinians during the First Intifada, we're talking about tens of thousands. In the case of the torture report, between 39 and 44 cases. And that was during the period of Palestinian nonviolent resistance.
I mean, the press, for their narratives, rely on Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. How do you see their role? Because I know sometimes you quote Human Rights Watch, but then you'll say even Human Rights Watch. Is their role critical in the West understanding, certainly the people of the West understanding the brutality?
You can make subtle differentiations. I think Amnesty International, because it's a grassroots organization, it's more independent than Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch often ends up, in my opinion, covering up for Israel. But in general, the human rights reports haven't, I don't want to put it in negative, I'm going to put it in affirmative. They've been good. And there's no question that public opinion has significantly changed on the issue. There's no question that the human rights reports have made a significant contribution in causing public opinion to shift and for there now to be a very harsh opinion of Israel. The harsh opinion of Israel has not translated into a positive opinion of the Palestinians. Still, if you ask to choose between Israelis and Palestinians, publics overwhelmingly choose Israel as the more decent party.
On anti-Semitism, which is in the press here, it was interesting because they said the rise in anti-Semitism in Britain, people were connecting it to the onslaught on Gaza. How have you seen the reporting of this?
There's no evidence whatsoever of a resurgence of anti-Semitism. What you find is periodically, whenever Israel engages in one of its murderous assaults, there's an increase, a spike in what's called anti-Semitic incidents. So you saw that during Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, you saw it again during Cast Lead, and you saw it again during Protective Edge this past summer. The question is it anti-Semitism? Here is a state that calls itself the state of the Jewish people. And you have a head of state who happens to be a maniac, and he goes around saying, I represent all of world Jewry. He said, when I'm going to Paris, he said, I'm representing all of world Jewry. When I'm going to the Congress to speak about the so-called threat from Iran, I'm representing all of world Jewry. So then you're going to fault people for taking him at his word? He's saying, when I say we should attack Iran, I'm representing all of world Jewry. When I say we should attack Iraq, I'm representing all of world Jewry. When I say we should attack Lebanon again, when I say we should attack Hamas again, or Gaza again, I'm representing all of world Jewry. So you have a maniac who claims to represent all of world Jewry, and then people take him at his word and think, okay, if he represents all of world Jewry, then Jews are a problem. That's the logical conclusion. So if there's anyone who's causing the problem, it's the state of Israel and its head of state who keep claiming that their murderous actions are in the name of world Jews. There's a simple way to solve the problem. Stop calling yourself the state of the Jewish people, because you're not. You're the state of Israel. And stop claiming that you represent all of world Jewry, because world Jewry did not vote you. Nobody gave you that title. It's not surprising that in the face of a state that calls itself the state of the Jewish people and a head of state who claims to be acting, that there are going to be anti-Semitic incidents. Does that make it anti-Semitism? I don't know why you would call, if by anti-Semitism you mean an irrational, which is generally how people try to construe it, an irrational hatred of Jews. That's not an irrational hatred of Jews.
Norman Finkelstein, thank you.
You're welcome.